All right, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. We had a little bit of a hiccup there with the backdrop, but I'm Eric Eager. I'm here with Thomas Dimitroff. We are a week away from Super Bowl Radio Row. We are 2 weeks away from Super Bowl 58. Thomas, how you doing?
I'm doing well. It's a perfect lead-in on our buddy Scotty Farrell. Only because it was on my mind. We're going to Vegas. It's going to be another Biggie Allen Media Row, right? It's going to be a lot of work for us. We love it because we get a chance to really market Sumer and the product. Just so everyone knows, over the last few months, I mean, Scott Farrell was in the hospital and had some cardiac issues, like legitimate. And I can't wait to see him there all healed up, as healed up as possible. You and I had some great times with him last year when you were swearing on Farrell's show, and he couldn't believe it. Of all guys, he was worried about you swearing, and now here he is. We can't wait to be on his show again. And he sent his regards just now. He texted me, and I was thinking about it all.
Yeah, people don't know this because I've kept it mostly to myself, which is rare given how much of an open book I am. But I'm very good at media impressions, and Scotty Farrell is one of my favorite to do. I'm going to save it, though. I'm going to save my Peter King one as well, which I can't wait to see Peter King. I can't wait to see Scotty Farrell. I can't wait to see Matt Stopsky, the guy who's produced shows for us, who's going to run us around. And anybody who listens to the show who's going to be in the media, obviously give us a DM. I'd love to, obviously have you meet everybody. By the way, Jason Fitzgerald, who hosts the Over the Cap podcast, he waxed poetic about this show. He was mostly applauding you, Thomas, for how much you add, and said briefly, Eric, which I love the fact, like another Minnesotan, Prince, I just have one name. Eric does a good job of setting Thomas up to talk about stuff. But Jason Fitzgerald also has a great podcast. Honestly, it's my favorite other than this one. And so if any other media members who listen to the show want and are going to the Super Bowl, I'd love to have you meet Thomas. Would love to give you a signed copy of the book. I got a big collection of the books here that we can give you. So that's just a plug for next week. We will have people who are going to host this show that are other than me and Thomas. We're still arranging that for Monday and Wednesday, but we will be going on other shows, but we will have this time slot manned here. So that'll be great.
I got one more deal here. So we're talking to Matt Stopsky, and he's setting up all these, we have almost 40 different spots on Radio Row. But Stopsky revealed today that your guy here, Eric Eager, is like taking the world by storm, and all of these national media and different people want him alone. They don't want us pairing up. They're all about Eric Eager. So hopefully we're not going to be watching Eric from behind as he takes off into other areas in media one day. We got to keep him firmly entrenched here, not let his head get too big. That Minnesota head sometimes can get a little bit big. We just got to keep you corralled a little bit.
Well, Well, usually it's dealing with the cold, which we don't really have a problem with here in the great Atlanta area. This was a big week, right? This was a week where a lot of stuff happened, and I also believe, given what happened this week with Ben Johnson's Detroit Lions losing a game at the hands of the Niners despite a 17-point halftime lead, and then Mike McDonald's Ravens losing to the Chiefs as favorites at home in the AFC title game, we might see the last two positions coalesce this week as well. But we've had some significant movement, right? It started with the Chargers. Jim Harbaugh is going to be their head coach. They have still not decided on who their general manager is. They're interviewing a few candidates. Joe Horowitz, who is of the Baltimore Ravens, has been considered one of them.
Not Horowitz. That's a very different. It's not Horowitz.
I'm sorry. Did I add vowels to the name? Horowitz?
You added vowels, but that's okay. I just want to check you because normally a guy with a big brain like you're not going to do that. But look his name up. You can see that it's not. They're two different nationalities.
Hortitz. There we go. Joe Hortitz. Sorry. of the Baltimore Ravens. You caught me on that one. Okay.
Not Hortitz, Ortiz.
And then, but they have their coach, Jim Harbaugh. The Las Vegas Raiders decided to make Antonio Pierce their full-time coach. They removed the interim tag.
Yeah.
Los Angeles connections, though. Tom Telesco, the former general manager of the Los Angeles Chargers, he is now the general manager of the Las Vegas Raiders. So that move was made. The Tennessee Titans made Brian Callahan, the son of the son of the former Raiders coach, Bill Callahan, former Nebraska Cornhuskers coach as well. Great offensive line coach in the NFL. He is now their head coach. He comes over from Cincinnati. That one was a little bit of a surprise, as was Carolina's hiring of Dave Canales, the former offensive coordinator of the Bucs, previously the quarterbacks coach of the Seattle Seahawks. Also, they had, and this was announced last week as well, but Dan Morgan, the former linebacker of the Panthers, former executive with the Seahawks as well. He is now the general manager of the now he's the general manager of the Carolina Panthers. There is a report out there, although it's not official, that Brand Tillis is going to go with him as the senior VP, working on the cap side of that. But because it's not a GM position, that it has to be when the Chiefs are done and they're in the Super Bowl. What other ones are we missing, Thomas? We have Washington, obviously, with Adam Peters. That's been for a long. They're still head coach searching. Seattle is still head coach searching as well. We've had a bunch of moves here. And then obviously the big one here in our hometown, the Atlanta Falcons, who are rumored at many times to be a destination for one Bill Belichick. They threw everybody a curveball and hired former defensive coordinator and former Tampa Bay Buccaneers coach Raheem Morris as their head coach.
So there's a lot here. I mean, maybe we can start quickly or early in this conversation with the fact that Dan Quinn and Mike Vrabel, right? I'm trying to think of who else is out there without a placement at this point. Obviously, the two young guys, right? Where are all these really good coaches going to go here? And in the end, can you imagine if Bill Belichick, Mike Vrabel, Dan Quinn, and not necessarily in that order, if those three men and one of the others, right? Well, or maybe not, maybe the two young guys, talking about, Ben Johnson as well as Mike McDonald, right? Mm-hmm. Are they the two that are going to get those jobs, as people have been rumoring? It's unfathomable to me that Bill, Dan, and Braves would be out of a job this year.
That appears to be, though, like if you're following the tea leaves, right? If you're looking at, because if Seattle or Washington were going to hire somebody other than those two, they could have done it by now, right? And that was kind of like Tennessee always felt like a natural place where Mike McDonald could have gone. I think Carolina was always had the reports where they had their eyes set on Ben Johnson. And as Detroit progressed in the playoffs, they decided to cut bait and go with Canales, right? So it's been, it looked like a situation where they could have made moves here and haven't. And in the case of McDonald, I don't think it's a done deal because the Seattle has not interviewed him yet. They haven't even interviewed him remotely. They had their chance to. They missed that opportunity. And I think over the course of the past couple of weeks, I mean, that wasn't when we looked at that game the other day. And I know we're not breaking down these games, but the Ravens defense played a phenomenal game yesterday against Kansas City. Kansas City had 6 first downs the entire second half. And basically after the first 2 drives, the Chiefs didn't really do much offensively. I think he was phenomenal. But there could be a situation where they finally get the chance to interview him and he doesn't interview well. And then it ends up being an underdog like Dan Quinn, maybe, Bill Belichick, possibly. And so I think, or, Ejiro Evero, somebody else who's come in the mix. This Washington job, it feels like they've been spinning their wheels for about a month waiting for Ben Johnson. That's been the report. But again, you have to wait until they sign. And so far, we're a day into both guys being eliminated. We still haven't seen any news.
Yeah, look, there's a lot to talk about. You threw it all out in one fell swoop. Do we want to touch on each area and talk a little bit about it, or what?
Well, because I think let's talk about Harbaugh for a second here with the Chargers, right? So they haven't picked their general manager yet. That team, everybody's going to look at San Francisco, right? And I actually had a tweet about this. Like, if you look at San Francisco when Harbaugh took over, yes, they were a 6-10 team. But that team had Navarro Bowman, Patrick Willis, Justin Smith. This was the team you played against, right? They had Dante Whitner. They had Deshaun Goldston. They had, Joe Staley, Vernon Davis, Frank Gore, Michael Crabtree. That team was undercoached, and he got there and made them a Super Bowl contender like right away. I don't think that this Chargers team, talent-wise, is really there yet. And they had the cap problems. Like, I think this is more every other stop in Jim Harbaugh's career, Thomas, has been more I think what the Chargers are going to be, which like University of San Diego, it took a little bit of time. Stanford, it took a little bit of time. And then the University of Michigan, like they didn't beat Ohio State until like 3 years ago, right? Like they weren't this powerhouse in the NCAA until just recently. And so I think a lot of people look at that Harbaugh signing and think, oh, this team's going to be a Super Bowl contender right away. And I think part of it's the quarterback, but I think people are going to have to exercise a little bit of patience with the Chargers because of kind of the history of kind of where Harbaugh wants to come in and establish his culture. And in San Francisco is kind of like a fluke, I think, the way that it happened so quickly with them.
Remember I said the president, John Spanos, he has a really good grasp, along with his father, of course, the owner, Mr. Spanos at the Chargers. They know what they want. They just finished an interesting run of how many different coaches with Tom Telesco? 3, I believe, correct?
Yeah, it was Norv Turner into Mike McCoy into Anthony Lynn into Staley, right? Brandon Staley.
So, and look, a lot of times people will look at the coach that they just moved on from, and they will take the list of salient issues and they will say, okay, the next coach we get, we need to make sure that we take care of these handful of issues. And that's what they normally do. It doesn't always mean they're going to get a hard ass guy who's going to come in and be just a player's coach and very easily get along with. It's not always that. It just maybe they may be picking the 5 or 6 issues that need to be taken care of that this new coach coming in might be different. My point on that is people can argue Staley was, a little bit persnickety or cantankerous or whatever. I don't even know the exact word that was describing him. Now you're bringing in a guy. It's not like you're bringing in Dan Quinn, who's very affable and upbeat energy guy, right? Of course, Jim Harbaugh is a very good coach, and I like Jim Harbaugh. I like his family, and I think he can do really good things for sure. And yet he's a very different personality than Dan, right?
Yeah.
So I just say that right now, what I feel like is the Chargers are looking at this saying, okay, we're going to bring in what we deem is the best coach for us to give us the best opportunity to get out of this rut and utilize this excellent quarterback we have and build. And this is the direction they went. Now, I've mentioned – go ahead.
Yeah, you have a great stadium. You have a great new stadium. You have a great city. You have great quarterback. There's a lot to like about that job, to your point.
And now, though, again, it's complicated because you bring in the head coach before you bring in the GM. We talked about this a little bit before, right? Who is that going to be? What does that fit for Jim, Harbaugh? What does it fit for the Spanos family? What are they looking for? Are they looking for a young guy who's highly acquiescent, or are you looking for a guy who's got enough about him, who's going to stand up to Jim, because that's ideally what you would want. Jim's obviously he's got a really strong personality and a belief in how he wants things to be. Does this GM come in as GM light? Remember, GM light,
Well, Alex says you drop a phenomenal word or two in every show. You do, by the way, and it inspires me every once in a while to drop something from the.
You've been dropping some really good words. But my point here is, think about this, everyone. Like, this is a really big deal. Who is that GM going to be that would pair ideally? You need that partnership to be in line one way or another. You need, if you have a really strong guy, you can't bring in another guy, in my mind, who's like going to battle and they're going to be banging heads every time you turn around. I always said to Dan Quinn, and Dan and I and Smitty and I agreed to the same thing. You have to be up, you have to be settled and even keel when your head coach is flying off the handle, right? That's part of your deal. And when I'm flying off the handle as a GM during times of making decisions, I can't have my head coach at the time flying off the handle too, and we're both way up here. It doesn't work. Having an understanding of where that is huge with that partnership. However, if you have a man like Jim Harbaugh, who's not really that concerned about making sure that he's keeping his GM in a settled spot, that means you have to have a GM who is pretty even keel all the time. This is an interesting thing. I just want you to know that, because it's all about making sure that that partnership is very good and solid and sound for the Spanoses, so that they don't have in 2 years what they had before. And remember, this is a really interesting situation. If you all want to do your research and go back when two really, really talented football men were together, but it blew up because they were always at loggerheads. You know who it was? Marty Schottenheimer and A.J. Smith. Two tough asses in the league.
San Diego, right? And
exactly.
Right.
I used that.
That was always.
Let me just say, I used that as my example when I went in with Arthur Blank and interviewed, and he was asking, wow, Mike Smith, really? Mike was a neophyte like me. And I was saying my goal was to make sure that I started off, and this is an interesting segue, I started off my time as a general manager with a head coach that I could work with and who wasn't always banging heads with me. Okay, which we can go over to what's going on in Carolina, what's going on in Tennessee, what could be going on in Washington. Younger GMs who want to kick their careers off in the right way, and they're not just getting their asses kicked by a hard-ass coach.
Well, one question I do want to ask, because I think Sean asked a really good question before we move on to that point. Do you think there's an edge for college coaches coming into the league and scouting just based on information, recruiting, and having played against them? My intuition says no. Because I looked at it, and I think, so Harbaugh has clearly had success. Pete Carroll has had success. But, like, I look at, like, Matt Rule, who brought a bunch of Temple and Baylor players into that mix because of familiarity. I think it takes discipline if you're going to try to lean on that skill set to not just bring in players that you're familiar with. What do you think?
It's a great question. Who asked the question, by the way?
Sean Donahue.
Sean Donahue, of course. Sean, great question, and there's a lot of layers to it. The most important layers, however, are, yes, when we brought in Dan Quinn, he had a really good grasp of that recruiting class, right? So think about this. Jim Harbaugh comes in with a great understanding over the next few years of that. And then it eventually, runs its course. So there's a lot of positives per character and the type of player that he wants, because he's interviewed a lot of them. He has a lot of background information. That's really important. You can't expect, however, a head coach like that to come in and say, okay, not only is it his understanding of character, intelligence, et cetera, and all the context he has in the NCAA, but it is now you have to make sure that you do rely on your scouting staff, your general manager, who understand personnel and what's in the league, right? So you can't just override everyone in this situation with a college coach that comes in and just says he knows everything about everything, because that's where you can go awry, right? You start relying on everything you have as a college coach in your interaction, but you don't pay attention to your scouting staff who have been really in the weeds in professional scouting, because there is a difference there. Great positives on both sides. You just have to work together, and you have to listen to each other, GM and head coach, in this situation.
That's a really, I think that's a great answer, I think, contextually. And I think, like, a lot of times, that's what people miss from the going from college to pro is, like, you have to lean on the two different skill sets. And, I thought that he did a really good job. Now, it's interesting what you said about the time period and how it expired, right? Because you think about Harbaugh, 11, they're in the conference championship, 12, they're in the Super Bowl, 13, they're in the conference championship, 14, he's gone because he and Balky's relationship got balky, for lack, pardon the pun. And, that's kind of when it expired. You know what I'm saying? Like that time period. Now, Pete Carroll's a renegade in that he lasted for a decade in the NFL or more, actually, a little bit more than that, actually. And when he got to Seattle, like his first picks were not USC Trojans. And it was, he went against the grain. I mean, honestly, like there's a lot of similarities between him and you as far as like how you had kind of cut across, I would say predetermined, how would I even say like predetermined, like priors. But I do think you have to be willing to kind of move off of that. And it's a really good discussion there. Now, were you moving on to Tennessee? Were you surprised that in a world where, for example, Atlanta put Raheem Morris direct line to Arthur Blank, Terry Fontenot direct line to Arthur Blank in reporting structure, were you surprised that Brian Callahan reports directly to Rand Carthon now? Like that, after that breakup between, Mike Vrabel, who is the larger-than-life head coach, to your point, Rand Carthon comes in, kind of has a nondescript first year in a good way, right? Like not bad, but Rand Carthon comes in, kind of bides his time. Now he's kind of in charge of he's the grand poobah there, right? Like he's in charge of everything, including the head coach who reports to him. That kind of is different than what we're seeing in the rest of the league. Dave Canales reports now to David Tepper, as does Dan Morgan. Tennessee seems to be the one place that has the vertical reporting structure now.
Okay, so you look back when, for instance, John Robinson came in, and most of the people around the league in our positions as general managers envied him because he had full keys to the kingdom as the GM. So there's a track record there with Amy Adams Strunk, who will pass it over to the GM. I think she's got a good, strong feeling about that's what her preference would be. I don't know that for sure, but it seems that way. John Robinson moves on, and the head coach gets an opportunity to step up and be the guy in control, and Mike Vrabel. And within a year, she decided, I'm not having this. I'm going back to the general manager, the executive, having final say. That's a big move for Rand Carthon to move in 1 year in, and a year where, of course, they didn't do that well. And this is not against Rand. I'm just saying it's not like they rose to the top and won all these games where she could use it as a justification or rationalization. And so Rand gets full keys to the kingdom right now. Great for him. I think everyone who likes Rand a lot are cheering him on, right? As I am. I think it's a great opportunity for him. But to me, it really indicates that she wasn't that concerned about the media view of something like that. It was more like, I want my GM and Rand, who's a good guy and he's good to work with. That's what she wants. So I'm not surprised. And again, she's not like, she doesn't need to have that. I mean, I think she's got a strong presence about her, but to have the football people report to her probably doesn't feel as right to her. I don't know why, comparatively speaking to two guys like Arthur Blank and you said Josh Harris, they're reporting to Josh Harris. Is that, or
I have to look at, well, we don't know because the head coach hasn't officially been hired there, but we know, for example, in Carolina, let's tie it here because this is what makes it curious for me. Rand comes from the 49ers, who have the two structure, right? With Lynch and Shanahan parallel, right? So that's what Rand's background is. They're trying to emulate that in Carolina, right? They've had a lot of fits and starts. They had Rivera, they had Gettleman, they had Fitterer, Reich, and Rule. Like, and that none of that has worked yet. We don't have to editorialize, like the stats are the stats. And now, they're trying to, and I'm not breaking any news, but the Parag, Lynch, Shanahan, they're trying to emulate that in Carolina. But Rand is getting a situation different than that in Tennessee, which is different than his upbringing in San Francisco, or at least the close. I mean, he was with you in Atlanta, but he wasn't an executive there. So it's kind of funny to me because, for example, Brant Tillis, he didn't have that back. That wasn't how it was in Kansas City. Kansas City's very much the head coach. And I guess the head coach had the most power there. The general manager had less, although it was growing. It's kind of interesting how the chairs have aligned here, because it seems like, especially in the case of Tennessee, it's different than I would have expected somebody like Rand Carthon, who's had with his background, to have had it shaken out that way.
Yeah, look, I think the big thing for me is Rand's getting an opportunity he's getting an opportunity to do something that not a lot of people get a chance to do. And there's a track record of it there. And here he is. He hires a coach like Callahan. And by the way, I'm a big fan of Callahan. I am of the family. And even back in the days when Coach Callahan, young Callahan, was at UCLA, I really liked interacting with him. You pull for a guy like this. And I'm sure Rand, when he sat down there again with Anthony Robinson, who was one of our personnel directors at Atlanta, who's now the assistant GM, they're saying, look, we need the right person in here with a lot of intelligence, a lot of background. Look, to me, when you grab someone who has all his life been involved with football at the level he has, I have a really interesting bond with that, but I think it's a great thing. So you take that, even though he's young, and you maybe add exponentially his experiences at a lot of levels. He's been around a lot of coaches, ups and downs. I think it's a really interesting, and I think it's a good hire.
If you go to sumersports.com, I agree with you. I wrote in my Friday column that that's my favorite head coaching hire so far is Brian Callahan. If you look at his metrics for our coaching model, if you look at, the Bengals, weirdly, Thomas, had a top 10 offense by season's end in some of our predictive stuff without Joe Burrow. And in a lot of cases, with Jamar Chase hurt, with T. Higgins hurt, without a great offensive line. And with his dad, if his dad even if his dad doesn't coach, that team's going to have an offensive line, right? Just with his influence, that team's going to have an offensive line that's a real offensive line. Levis is the draft pick, they'll figure that out. They got Levis and Willis, two young quarterbacks. We'll see what they end up doing with the running back there, and Hopkins as well. That's not a great roster. They have some work to do. The division is going to be, now that Houston has a quarterback, Indy has a great head coach and a young quarterback, it's going to be tougher, but I'm really interested there. Let's talk about when we look at, let's talk about Atlanta, because, and I want to segue into the Belichick thing, but it's hard not to read all the people who love Raheem Morris and not think about at least, look, obviously the Belichick is the opportunity cost. When you hire a guy like Raheem Morris over Bill Belichick, you're giving up an opportunity to have one of the best people who's ever coached in the NFL in your building, right? And there's obviously, reported baggage associated with that, but, he's the best. He has 6 Super Bowl rings. He has 2 as a coordinator. He's forgotten more football in the last 3 years than most of us will ever know. So, but I think if you're the Falcons and you decide not to hire Belichick, I can't think of a better hire than Raheem Morris as far as what you're trying to do as a franchise, as far as you're trying to get the most out of your group. You're trying to build up morale in a team that has not, for 3 straight years has gone 7-10 after you guys left, right? And you're just trying to get this thing off the ground. Every single person that I've talked to in the NFL reveres Raheem Morris. And Zach Robinson comes in as the OC. Maurice Williams is staying as the special teams coordinator. Again, it's complicated because you gave up on the opportunity to hire Belichick. But just in a vacuum, I think Raheem Morris was an outside the box hire that makes some sense to me.
Raheem, as you know, was there with us during Dan Quinn's run. He was Dan Quinn's right-hand guy, right? He coached on the offensive side, the defensive side. He was Dan's assistant head coach, not assistant to, but assistant head coach. And of course he was a head coach before, with Tampa Bay, though his record wasn't exactly what he wanted it to be. He had some great experiences, and then he goes to Los Angeles and does some really good things there with their defense. You want to comment on his defensive stats? Can we pull anything up?
back when you and I were working together, before we were working together, like we would build these reports for each other. And what was crazy was Brandon Staley got a head coaching job. And again, this speaks again to the DEI thing as well. Brandon Staley's a 1-year young white head coach, or DC, and he was doing all the KPIs. He was the split safety stuff, the stunting, like the small box stuff. He was spamming the league with all the Vic Fangio stuff, and he did great. And that Rams defense propelled Jared Goff into the playoffs, even though Jared Goff had one of his worst years, and he got a head coaching job when no one expected him to. Now you have Raheem, who was a head coach a decade ago, but for the most part has been mostly overlooked since, African-American, right? And he took all those metrics. So again, the amount of time you switch safeties pre-snap, the amount of time you stunt, the amount of time you play light boxes when other teams don't expect you to, all these disguising, deception things that actually move the needle in football. Raheem Morris did them at rates higher than Brandon Staley, and they won the Super Bowl. And yet it took him 3 more years to get a head coaching job. And so, again, this is what people are talking about when they're talking about kind of the inequities that kind of occur in these situations, right? Where, one guy does one thing and the other guy does the same thing better, and it takes him 3 years as long. And I know that there are other sort of circumstances that obviously exist, but again, he deserves this opportunity, for that 2021 season alone. And then you go to this year, there is Aaron Donald, and then there is, Ernest Jones is a pretty good player. John Johnson's a guy that came back. Akello Witherspoon's played in the league for a while. But you look at that defense, it's all 4th, 5th, 6th round picks. And they were in the middle of the pack in the NFL. That team won 10 games and didn't really have any players. And I look at him and he's everybody talked about the great job that the Niners did in the second half of yesterday's game against the Lions. The Lions scored 3 points in the second half of their playoff game too against the Rams. And so I think he's done a great job. And again, we'll talk about Belichick in a moment, but this guy deserves an opportunity to be the head guy, especially after, when he was with Tampa Bay, how much he's evolved since then. Yeah,
there's no question. I want to make this very clear that there's no question that I don't believe that he should get a chance. This was his time to get another opportunity. I was pretty outspoken about it a couple weeks ago, not just here, but Kay Adams or wherever else we did it, because obviously he has a lot. He's now in his mid-40s, right? He's grown and learned so much. He's learned a lot through Dan as well, Dan Quinn, as far as, the great points and the challenges along the way. I mean, I've said this before. I mean, he is an incredibly sharp guy and I was telling him the other day, I mean, he has a knack about him. You want to talk about quick-witted, quick response, never trips over his words. I mean, he's got a very, very sharp mind. And so point is, they're going to ride the optimism here in Atlanta with him, right? Even as he's growing and moving, because he's still going to be growing in that position. He's got a younger general manager, so they have 2 younger guys in this role. And without now, as you know, because Rich McKay's been moved away, so they are devoid of senior football leadership that will be working with these guys. Though Raheem has a lot of experience, don't get me wrong, and so does Terry. Not as a GM, and head coach, they're kind of coming back into that. That's going to be an interesting thing, how they work together, and I'm sure they'll work very well together. So good. I think I was surprised that he ended up in Atlanta, only because I thought he would be there. There might be another opportunity that might be fresh, because he spent time there, as you know. Not only was he in the building, but then it was also the interim coach. I just sometimes think sometimes that's not how it happens. So to Arthur Blank's credit, he had an idea of what. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think the Rich McKay thing, after you guys were let go, he had Raheem in the building, and he let him go, and then 3 years later, you're hiring him.
Sure.
I think that it's something. To your point about he's no longer the football executive there, the senior football executive. I think everybody talks about the Antonio Pierce being the one interim that's hired. In a way, Raheem went somewhere else, won a Super Bowl, built up his bona fides after that. But like who knows how different it would have been had the Falcons just run it back with Raheem Morris after he had been the associate, after he had been the interim. And I think that's part of the reason why, Rich McKay, like they made a decision to move Rich McKay off of football. That could have been one of the thought processes. I don't know. I'm not there, but like that could have been one of the reasons.
Well, look, I mean, let's talk a little bit more about Raheem before we move over to Bill Belichick. So Raheem, interestingly enough, for the last little while, he and I have been communicating. I introduced him to you and Sean Clement, our VP of data. He has some real growing interest in where data is going in this league. It wasn't just pushed on him. Like, he understands how important it is. Not saying that he's going to go and carry the proverbial flag for it, but he's going to grow and learn with it, which I think is great. I think Sumer Sport can be a really good positive as far as whenever someone in that situation is needed. I'm not just talking about Raheem. I'm talking about any head coaches or GMs that need to continue to grow with that. It's not easy, of course, but they realize how important it is. Without getting into details, because that's not our place to say that. What I am saying is I love that he's interested in looking at the next waves of really important
Let's put the chips down. When he was a Bucs coach, they were 10-6 in 2010, as you know, because he was in your division. They had bad statistics. So they were a team that everybody, like all the dorks like me, were like, this team's not very good. You know what I mean? Like, because and he came out and said stats are for losers, which, Thomas, if I were an NFL head coach and our stats sucked, I would tell the media stats are for losers, right? Because you got to motivate your freaking team, right?
Yeah.
So I would have said that, right? And so there's, but you get somewhere, right? And you go to different places like Atlanta, and you go to LA, and you watch Sean McVay, who's a great play caller, but you probably lost the playoff game because you took your timeouts too early, right? You learn, and again, this is all experience. You have the hardwired, and I was telling Tage, Tage is, his Lions. I was like, it's got to break your heart sometimes before you can truly win, right? And when you're a head coach in the NFL at 33 years old or whatever he was, it's different now, right? And so of course he's going to come back when he's in his mid 40s and be like, I got to learn all these other things. Like, look at Pete. When Pete Carroll was the coach of the Jets, right? They started 6-5, went 0-5 down the stretch, and they fired him for Rich Kotite. Rich Kotite. Somebody wanted Rich Kotite instead of Pete Carroll 30, 40 years ago, right? And now Pete's a all-time great coach, right? Like and so it's great that Raheem Morris, was a coach all those years ago, got better, and now is like wanting to be better. I think that's a mark of somebody who's great, right? I mean, it's similar for us. Like you were a end time executive of the year. Now you're running a football analytics company. It's the same thing, right? It's like you all grow and adapt, and that's how it works.
Great point. There's a lot there to talk about, and
Can I throw you my hot take here?
Yeah, go.
So do you follow the NBA particularly closely? I know your wife's family is a basketball family, so maybe.
Yeah.
So we just had the Bucks fire a coach mid-season, which they just fired their other coach in the offseason, the guy that won a championship for that. It's a rough business if you're a basketball coach. Now, granted, basketball's a little easier to be the coach because it's all your spot. It's not that trivial, but it's easier to be a basketball coach than a football coach, I think. But they just fired him. They brought Doc Rivers off of ESPN, and he's not going to be the coach. He comes in. He hasn't been with the team all year. He's the coach. That's weird, I think. That's never happened in the NFL until this year. I think that Bill Belichick is going to be coaching an NFL team by the end of September.
That's big. Or you want the hot take? You want my response? I don't even know how to respond.
I think there's going to be a team with expectations this year that, and I'm not going to, editorialize. I just think Belichick, can pick a spot at some point. Like, if I'm a desperate franchise, and I just think there weren't enough desperate the Falcons were probably as close, right? And then they just decided to pull back a little and kind of slow the thing down a little bit, right? I think that if a franchise is like, if we don't win this year, that team will hire Bill early in the season to come turn the thing around, just like in basketball. I think that's going to happen. We have some guesses in the stands, by the way, in the chat.
You have some what?
We have some guesses in the chat.
Guesses. Well, okay. Just let me have my little diatribe here for a half a minute. I categorically think Bill Belichick is the best coach in this league. I've said it before. I think it's a once in a lifetime, once in a / generation opportunity for the owners in place. I've said this before, as well as the GMs, that is being passed up. And it's unfathomable to me that that's the case. Let me stop, full stop. All the other things that people are talking about with Bill, whether he's, Tom Brady moving on, whether he's, at that situation in his career where he might not respond as well to the younger players. Everyone's going to pull all these different things out. And the main thing, that he would come into an organization and turn it upside down because he would be in charge. Yes, he deserves to be in effing charge.
A coach, you need that.
That's what this guy is. Okay, he gets the right people around him, which he's very good. He was going to – you have Josh McDaniels. You can say whatever you want to say about Josh as a head coach, one of the closest to genius-like as an offensive coordinator. He is a situational mastermind. Okay, don't get me started too much here. The point is, it is unbelievable in my mind that people start trying to justify and rationalize why not to hire him. And
especially in a season where there was like 7 openings. That's the one that I don't get is like, and they're not in the playoffs. I'm a big fan of Mike McDonald. I'm a big fan of the Ravens in general. But if he didn't get a head coaching job this cycle, I get it in the sense of they're in the playoffs too long and you need to make your decision. Bill, they were out. Like, you've had the whole month. That's the thing I don't get. I get, the point that's interesting to me is if you need to hire a head coach, most of these franchises are in trouble if they're hiring a head coach, right? Like, that's the point. If you're firing somebody, it's because you're in a position where you need a little bit of an upshake, right? And there have been, and I'm not gonna name any names, but there have been some organizations where there have been some politicking when it's like, guys, you went X and Y this year, where X is much smaller than Y. There need to be some changes, right? That's where I get worried. That's why I wonder about the posturing it makes me a little. I'm normally an optimist. I get a little pessimist sometimes.
Well, I think there's a lot of people. There's a lot of interaction, not just people like me who are formers at this point in their career, whether they're going back or not is, time will tell. But there's a lot of people that are disgruntled by the direction of the league in the sense of, I'm not talking about from Commissioner Goodell's standpoint at all. I'm saying direction of the league from team to team and how their hiring is going down and the approach. There are people out there saying, okay, you're not hiring some of these unbelievable coaches that are out there. And is that suggesting that they're not truly looking at this in the direct from the standpoint of, we're trying to get the best coach in here to get us a Super Bowl win versus, we want to win, but we want our offices to be similar, whatever that may be. I'm not far from just talking about Atlanta. I'm talking about in general. Those are big decisions that are made by not only the owner, but by the general manager, who could be an incumbent general manager, right? Who really wants to make sure there's status quo in the building, and they don't want to deal with a power broker. Look, they did that. They avoided power broker in Detroit, and they did the right thing there, right? They hired a neophyte head coach and a neophyte general manager in Brad Holmes, who won Executive of the Year, or at least Sports Writers Association, and he's doing really good things there, of course. So they did the right thing. Not some people can do that, some people can't. All I'm saying is there are some coaches right now that are out there, 3 in particular, and one leading the pack, who is a great football coach. and it's unbelievable that they might end up bringing this full circle. They
I think if you were creating a betting market and you took the 3 older coaches, right, and you said Harbaugh, Belichick, and Vrabel, and said which one would get the only one of them getting a job, I think Harbaugh would have been the underdog, in my opinion, and now he appears to be the only one to have gotten it. So that's certainly a surprise. Part of me also wonders, and obviously, we'll never know this, if some of these jobs, maybe it goes both ways. Like, part of me was a little bit surprised that only the Falcons showed interest. I can't imagine that's true. And maybe some of these teams just didn't show enough. And I don't know, but I'm just so surprised. Because to your point, like, has Belichick changed a little? Kind of, but his defenses are still, like, if you look at all of our metrics at Sumer, New England's phenomenal. You still look at his contribution to the point spread, he's still positive. Offensively, he just hasn't had a quarterback in a few years. But, like, look at Robert Saleh. Like, everybody's talking about the Jets in the chat and stuff. The Jets didn't have a quarterback this year, and they were not very good. It's not that hard. The league, I mean, when if Matt Ryan missed a season, I'm guessing you would have probably been like, we're kind of screwed. It's how it goes. And they took a swing on Mac Jones, it didn't work, and that's what happens. Like, it is what it is. I'm surprised it hasn't worked out that way. We still have 2 jobs open. I think by the next time we pod, we'll at least see one or both of those taken up, but who knows?
I can't help to touch on this topic before we move on. We're at 47 minutes. Of course, it's been a passionate discussion here. The talk that Bill Belichick will go to Kansas City and replace Andy when he retires after this year. Does it happen?
No. Andy Reid, like, from everything I know about everybody who's ever hung out with Andy Reid, the only negative is that Andy Reid cares too much about football. Like, if I had to bet on how Andy Reid will not retire, I would bet on Andy Reid not retiring before I bet on when he'll retire. Is that? Okay. I mean, you know him. Yep.
Yeah. No, I understand that. It came up and I was thinking, wow, can you imagine? I mean, there's so many ideas of what's going to happen.
I actually think Kansas City might be Jim Harbaugh's next job because his wife's from there and, like, he's got some ties to Kansas City. Yep. That is how long I think Andy Reid's going to coach there. Is I think Jim Harbaugh will be his next, like, it'll be that long. Like, I don't think it'll be anytime soon.
Last thing that's on my mind, and I have to voice it. It's not against Canales. It's not against, even Arthur Smith with 2 years as a coordinator. This 1 and 2 year coordinator getting hired thing is really unsettling for a lot of team builders out there quietly, right? There's a lot of discussion, like, why are we going in that direction? People always want to hear it. People in the business want to hear it. Downtown, when I'm out at places, they want to hear it. Like, tell me why in no other business would that be the case, that there's such a hot trot on, on these, not even young, but 1 or 2 year coordinators. Like, that's a big deal that become head coaches.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the list of NFL head coaches, I mean, Jonathan Gannon, he didn't have much experience as a coordinator, but the jury's still out on him. Zach Taylor was kind of a relatively, Kevin Stefanski had 1 year as a coordinator, but he was in the league for a long time. He's been okay, like okay to good. Obviously Staley, that was a flop. Shane Steichen's had at least a few years as a coordinator.
A few's different than 1 or 2, though.
It really is tough. It's a tough sell to me. The one that has been successful is Mike Tomlin. Mike Tomlin had 1 year. He was a Tampa Bay DBs coach. He had 1 year in Minnesota as the coordinator, and then he got the Pittsburgh job. Now, it's a little different when you go to Pittsburgh, which is Rooney, LeBeau,
That
you know,
that's where I'm going. He had a
whereas
group.
Carolina's been, Carolina's had their issues, right? And so I think if Seattle hired a first-time coordinator, I'd be a little bit more bullish. If Minnesota, right, which is a stable franchise, hired a first-time coordinator, be a little bit more bullish. But like the franchises that have struggled, right, or have had ownership shakeups, I'd be a little bit more likely to I'd be a little bit more back up a little bit. So
good conversation.
Yeah, this has been fun. Thank you all for coming to the chat here. We thank you all for listening. If you liked what you heard here, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Tell all of your friends about this show. Also, this cannot be understated. Tomlin also had Roethlisberger near the beginning of his prime, which of course makes a lot of sense. It's a little bit different than having Bryce Young, both size as well as strength at the beginning there. Apologize for my voice. It has been a privilege for a lot of this time. For Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show.